Adventures of Harry Nile.
Chapter 1. The Case Walks In. It was the kind of Seattle rain that didn't just fall. It loitered. It hung in the air like a bad memory, coating the windows of my third-floor office on Yesler Way with a greasy, translucent film. Outside, the city was a blur of smeared neon and exhaust fumes, the distant, mournful blast of a ferry horn echoing off the cold waters of Elliott Bay. Inside, it wasn't much better. The radiator was clanking out a rhythm that sounded like a dying man's last breaths, and the air smelled of stale tobacco, damp wool, and the bitter dregs of a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting behind a desk that had seen more losing hands than a Reno poker table, staring at a bottle of cheap bourbon. It was only 3 in the afternoon, but the sky outside was the color of a fresh bruise, bruised purple and heavy, making it feel like midnight. I fished a crumpled pack of Chesterfields from my breast pocket, tapped one loose against my thumb, and struck a paper match on the underside of the desk. The sulfur flared, casting long, jumping shadows against the peeling plaster walls. I took a deep drag, let the smoke coat the lining of my lungs, and blew a slow gray stream toward a ceiling fan that hadn't turned since Roosevelt's first term. That was when the shadow appeared behind the frosted glass of my office door. The lettering on the glass read Harry Nile, Private Investigations in black paint that was flaking away, much like my bank account. The shadow hesitated. People who come to my door usually do. They stand there in the hallway, weighing their desperation against their pride, wondering if whatever mess they're in is worth the $10 a day plus expenses I charge to dig around in the dirt. Usually desperation wins. The door opened with a whine of unoiled hinges. She stood in the doorway, a stark contrast to the grime of my office. She was wrapped in a belted trench coat that cost more than I made in a good month. The collar turned against the cold. Raindrops glistened like cheap diamonds in her dark, perfectly waved hair. She had the kind of face you usually see on billboards for high-end cosmetics. Sharp cheekbones, pale skin, and a mouth painted the color of fresh arterial blood. But it was her eyes that gave her. They were a cool, hard gray, darting around the room, taking inventory of the peeling paint, the overflowing ashtray, and finally settling on me. They were the eyes of a woman who was used to sizing up a room and figuring out exactly what it would cost to buy it or burn it down. "You're Harry Nile," she said. Her voice was smooth, a low alto that carried a hint of finishing school sandpapered down by a few years of city living. "That's what the door says," I replied, not getting up. "The part that hasn't chipped off anyway. Come in and close it. You're letting the misery out." She stepped inside, pushing the door shut behind her with a gloved hand. The scent of her hit me a second later, something floral and expensive, underlaid with the sharp tang of ozone from the rain. It was a perfume that belonged in the penthouse of the Olympic Hotel, not in a rundown office above a pawn shop. "I was told you were cynical," she said, pulling off her leather gloves finger by finger. "I didn't realize it was a professional trademark." "It saves time," I said, gesturing to the wooden chair opposite my desk. "Take a load off, Mrs., she corrected, taking the seat but sitting on the very edge of it, as if she were afraid the disappointment in the room might rub off on her coat. "Mrs. Evelyn Sterling." I leaned back, the springs of my chair protesting loudly. "All right, Mrs. Sterling, what brings you the cheap seats? Usually, women wearing shoes like yours go to the polished mahogany offices downtown when they misplace something." She didn't flinch at the observation. Instead, she reached into her handbag, a sleek, dark leather number with a silver clasp, and pulled out a silver cigarette case. She snapped it open, extracted a long white cigarette, and placed it between her lips. She waited. I leaned across the desk with my Zippo and provided the light. She inhaled deeply, her gray eyes locking onto mine over the flame. "I haven't misplaced something, Mr. Nile," she said, blowing the smoke out in a thin line. "I've misplaced someone, my husband." "Arthur Sterling," I said, taking a guess based on the monogram on the cigarette case she had just returned to her purse. "Yes, Arthur." She crossed her legs, the motion deliberate and precise. "He's an accountant, a partner at a firm on 4th Avenue, mild-mannered, predictable, the kind of man who wears suspenders and a belt at the same time. Sounds like a thrill a minute," I deadpanned. "When did he go missing?" "Tuesday morning," she said. Her voice was steady, too steady. Wives with missing husbands usually come in weeping, or at least wringing their hands. Evelyn Sterling looked like she was negotiating a corporate merger. He left for the office at his usual time, 8:15. He never arrived. He hasn't been home since. It's Friday afternoon, Mrs. Sterling. 72 hours is a long time for an accountant to be off the ledger. Have you called the cops? No, she said sharply. The word hung in the smoky air between us, and I don't intend to. Arthur values his reputation. If this is some sort of misunderstanding, a public police inquiry would be disastrous for his career. Lady, if he's been gone 3 days without a word, his career is the least of his worries. He's either in a hospital, a morgue, or a motel room in Tacoma with a blonde. She offered a tight, humorless smile. I assure you, Mr. Nile, it is not a blonde. Arthur doesn't have the imagination for infidelity, nor courage. Then why come to me? I asked, tapping my ash into a glass tray that already held the remains of a half-dozen Chesterfields. If he's just a predictable bean counter who took a wrong turn, a uniform could find him faster than I can. She leaned forward, and for the first time, the polished veneer cracked just a fraction. Because, Mr. Nile, I discovered something yesterday. Something that makes me realize I might not know my husband as well as I thought. She reached back into her expensive leather bag and withdrew a small, rectangular object. She placed it on the scarred wood of my desk and slid it toward me. It was a dark brown leather wallet, worn at the edges. I found this hidden behind a loose brick in the back of Arthur's closet, she said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. I was looking for a lockbox he keeps. I found this instead. I picked up the wallet. It was heavy. I flipped it open. Inside, there was a stack of bills, mostly 50s and 100s, enough to choke a horse. I didn't bother counting it, but my trained eye guessed there were easily $2,000 in there. That was a lot of scratch for a predictable accountant to keep shoved in a dark hole. But money was not the punchline. I pulled out the driver's license tucked into the clear plastic window. The photograph was of a man in his late 40s, thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses, looking like he had just been audited and failed. It was Arthur, all right. But the name printed next to the photo didn't say Arthur Sterling. It said Richard Trent. Richard Trent, I read aloud, letting the syllables roll around in the quiet room. There was also an address. An apartment building in Belltown, a neighborhood that was a long way from the manicured lawns of Broadmoor where I assumed Mrs. Sterling rested her head. Arthur doesn't know Richard Trent, Evelyn said, leaning back in her chair. At least he's never mentioned him, but the face is his. The description is his. He has 2 identities, Mr. Nile, the man with 2 names, and I want to know why. I kept digging through the wallet. Behind the driver's license were several more items. A membership card to a private club I'd never heard of, a dry cleaning ticket, and a matchbook. I pulled the matchbook out and examined it. The cover was glossy black with gold lettering that read, "The Velvet Lounge, Pioneer Square." Inside, 3 matches were missing. Tucked behind the matches was a small crumpled piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully. It was a baggage claim ticket from King Street Station. You haven't seen him since Tuesday morning, I said, laying the items out on the desk like playing cards. That's correct, she said, her gray eyes tracking my movements. Are you sure about that timeline, Mrs. Sterling? I asked, looking at her. Positive. Why would I lie? I don't know. People lie to me all the time. It's an occupational hazard. I tapped the baggage claim ticket with a nicotine-stained fingernail. Because this claim ticket from King Street Station is stamped. It's got a date and a time. So it's stamped Thursday, yesterday, at 2:15 in the afternoon. I leaned back, crossing my arms over my chest. If Arthur vanished on Tuesday, how did his secret wallet end up with a train station ticket purchased on Thursday? Evelyn Sterling didn't blink. She didn't gasp. She didn't look flustered, and she didn't act surprised. She just stared at me, the faint wisp of cigarette smoke curling up from her fingers. That was the moment I knew she was playing me. The timeline didn't hold, and she knew it didn't hold before she even walked into my office. The nervous wife routine was a costume, and the wallet was a prop. But the money inside it was real, and so was the look in her eyes, a look that said she needed a fall guy, a patsy, or just a blunt instrument to break something open. I fit the bill for all 3. Perhaps he came back to the house while I was out, she suggested smoothly. And left the wallet behind. Right. He came back to his house, hid a wallet with $2,000 in it behind a brick, and then vanished again. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a slightly dirty glass and pushed it across the desk toward her. You want to try again, Mrs. Sterling? Or should we just skip to the part where you tell me how much you're paying me to ignore the holes in your story? She eyed the bourbon, then me. A slow, genuine smile finally touched her red lips. It was a dangerous smile. $50 a day plus expenses. And a $200 bonus when you find out what's in that locker at King Street Station. She reached into her purse one last time and pulled out an envelope. She tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. There's $300 in there to start, Mr. Nile. I don't care about your methods, and I don't care about your manners. Just find my husband, or, at the very least, find Richard Trent. She stood up, buttoning the collar of her trench coat. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the office, the sharp click-clack of her heels echoing down the linoleum hallway until they faded into the ambient noise of the city. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the rain hammer against the glass. The air in the room still held the ghost of her expensive perfume, fighting a losing battle against the smell of my cheap tobacco. I looked down at the money on the desk, then at the baggage claim ticket, and finally at the matchbook from the Velvet Lounge. Small physical details. A mismatched timeline. A woman who was entirely too calm about a husband who lived a double life. It was a setup. I could smell it as clear as ozone in the air. Someone was maneuvering me onto a chessboard, and I was pretty sure I was slated to be a pawn. I picked up the heavy black receiver of my desk phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered against a backdrop of ringing phones and shouting voices. Central Precinct, Homicide. Sergeant Duffy. Duffy, it's Harry, I said, cradling the receiver between my shoulder and my ear as I gathered up the cash. Nile. To what do I owe the misery of hearing your voice? You got a dead body for me, or are you just calling to confess to being a public nuisance? Neither, unfortunately. I need a favor. Run a name for me. Richard Trent. Might be a local grinder, might be nobody. See if he's got a sheet. I could hear Duffy sighing through the line static. Give me an hour, Harry, but you owe me. The rate is 2 pastrami sandwiches from Goldberg's. You got it, Duff. I hung up the phone. I looked at the bourbon in the glass I had poured for Evelyn Sterling. It was a shame to waste it. I downed it in one swallow, the cheap liquor burning a welcome trail down my throat. The case had walked in. It was built on a lie, financed by dirty money, and smelled like a trap. I stood up, grabbed my fedora from the coat rack, and shrugged into my trench coat. I slipped my .38 snub-nose revolver into my shoulder holster, feeling the reassuring, heavy weight of it against my ribs. I turned off the desk lamp, plunging the office into the gray, watery gloom of the Seattle afternoon. I locked the door behind me and stepped out into the rain. The city was waiting, wet, cold, and indifferent. I had a train station to visit, a locker to open, and a man with 2 names to find. Another Friday in Emerald City. Chapter 2. The Streets Talk. King Street Station smelled of burnt coal, damp wool, and the frantic perfume of people trying to be somewhere else. The vaulted plaster ceiling arched high above, a grand piece of architecture designed to make a man feel small. It did its job perfectly. Beneath the ornate compass rose and the dangling globe lights, the waiting room was a sea of shifting fedoras, military uniforms, and cheap suitcases. It was 1948, and the war was long over, but the restlessness hadn't washed out of the city yet. People were still running. Some were running toward a new life on the coast. Others were running away from whatever they'd ruined in the old one. I figured Arthur Sterling, or Richard Trent, or whatever he was calling himself this week, fell squarely into the latter category. I navigated the polished marble floors, my trench coat heavy with the dampness of the streets, steering clear of a pair of shore patrolmen who were busy giving a drunk sailor the business. I found the baggage check over in the south wing, a long wooden counter manned by a kid with a bad complexion, a paper garrison cap, and a look of profound boredom. He looked at me like I was another problem he didn't want to solve. I slid the King Street Station claim ticket across the scarred wood. The kid barely glanced at it before turning around and disappearing into the shadowy canyon of metal storage racks. He came back a minute later, carrying a scuffed leather valise. It was the color of a bruised plum, with brass clasps that had lost their shine a decade ago. It didn't look like the kind of bag a high-end Fourth Avenue accountant would carry to the office. It looked like the kind of bag you buy in a pawn shop when you need to leave town in a hurry. "That's it," the kid said, his voice cracking. He didn't ask for identification. In this town, paper was just paper. I didn't open it right there at the counter. The station was too crowded, too many eyes looking for a distraction from their own miserable journeys. I carried the valise to a secluded corner near the shoeshine stands, dropping it onto a slatted wooden bench. It was surprisingly heavy. My gut tightened. In my line of work, heavy usually meant trouble. Trouble made of lead and steel, or trouble made of tightly bound paper. I snapped the brass catches. They opened with a tired metallic click. I peeled the stiff leather back. No dead bodies, no severed hands, just the mundane artifacts of a life coming apart at the seams. Lying on top was a gray wool sweater, the cheap kind that scratches your neck. Beneath that, a cardboard box of .32 caliber ammunition. I picked it up. It felt light. I slid the tray open. 4 shells were missing. A mild-mannered accountant with a missing husband routine, $2,000 shoved behind a brick, and a gun he'd apparently fired 4 times. The picture was getting clearer, and it looked exactly like a mugshot. Beside the ammo was a thick black leather-bound ledger. I opened it, expecting to find double-entry bookkeeping for some legitimate firm. It wasn't accounting, not the legal kind anyway. It was a handwritten list of names, dates, and numbers. Numbers were big, names were short and mostly aliases. Sully, 400, M, 1200, The Clock, 5000, bookmaking, or loan sharking, or both. Arthur Sterling wasn't just balancing books for a firm downtown. He was cooking them for someone in the shadows, or maybe running a side racket of his own. But the real prize was at the very bottom of the valise. A black and white photograph, slightly crumpled at the edges. It showed Arthur, wire-rimmed glasses, nervous smile, sitting in a leather booth next to a woman. She wasn't Evelyn Sterling. She was younger, with blonde hair styled in a severe victory roll, wearing a sequined dress that caught the flashbulb's blinding glare. She had her arm looped through Arthur's, a proprietary confident smile on her painted face. On the back of the photo, written in smudged blue ink, "Lola, the Velvet, New Year's." I shoved the photo, the ledger, and the ammo box into my coat pockets, closed the valise, and shoved it far under the wooden bench. Let the floor sweepers have the sweater. I found a row of wooden phone booths near the main entrance, dropped a nickel into the slot, and dialed Central Precinct. Duffy took the second ring. "Homicide," Duffy speaking. "And before you ask, no, your mother didn't call." "You're a riot, Duff. Did you run that name for me?" "I did, Harry. And you owe me more than pastrami. You owe me a whole damn brisket." I fished a cigarette from my pocket. "Don't hold out on me. Who is Richard Trent?" "Richard Trent," Duffy said, his voice dropping to a gravelly conspiratorial murmur, "was a dock worker, got crushed by a falling crate of engine parts down at Pier 52, broke his spine in 3 places. When did this happen?" "October, 1938. I struck a match, the sulfur sharp and biting in the cramped, airless booth. 10 years ago. You're telling me I'm looking for a ghost? I'm telling you someone lifted a dead man's name. It happens, Harry. You know how it is. A guy needs a new lease on life. He finds a tombstone belonging to someone about his age, pulls a birth certificate, and suddenly he's got a fresh slate. But here's the kicker. The address listed on that Trent alias you gave me, we raided that apartment building 6 months ago. It's a flop owned by Leo Cavallo." I blew smoke against the glass of the booth. Cavallo. The Clock, the name from the ledger in my pocket. Leo the Clock Cavallo ran half the numbers of rackets and illegal card games south of Yesler Way. If Arthur Sterling was renting an apartment from Cavallo under a dead man's name, he was deeper than a submarine. "Thanks, Duff. I'll bring the mustard." "Watch your back, Harry. Cavallo's boys don't play for nickels, and they don't leave witnesses." He hung up. I pushed out of the phone booth and headed for the heavy brass doors. Outside, the sky was a bruised charcoal, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement like spilled paint. I raised 2 fingers, and a yellow Plymouth taxi slid out of the gloom, its tires hissing loudly against the asphalt. I pulled the back door open and slid onto the cracked vinyl seat. "Where to, boss?" the driver asked. I looked at the hack license pinned to the sun visor. Sullivan Thomas. Sully, Long time no see. Pioneer Square. Drop me near the Velvet Lounge. Sully threw the car into gear, merging into the sluggish traffic with the reckless confidence of a man who had absolutely nothing to lose. He was an older guy, built like a fire hydrant, with a nose that had been broken so many times it looked like a modern art sculpture. Sully knew every alley, every back door, and every rumor in Seattle. He was my favorite library. "The Velvet," Sully grunted over his shoulder, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. "Are you slumming it tonight, Nile, or are you looking for a particular kind of trouble? That joint is strictly a mob and rob operation these days." "A little of both," I said, offering him a cigarette through the open partition. He took it, lighting it with a dash-mounted lighter that sparked dangerously. "What's the word on the street about the clock lately? Is he keeping busy?" Sully let out a short, barking laugh that sounded like a cough. "Cavallo is always busy. Word is, he's been bleeding money, some leak in his accounting. You ask me, someone's been skimming the cream. Cavallo's been sending his boys out to shake the trees, see what falls out. It's got the whole neighborhood twitchy. Why, you got business with the clock?" "Just looking for a guy," I deflected, watching the storefronts roll by. "An accountant type, wire-rimmed glasses, nervous disposition." Sully's eyes narrowed in the mirror. "A guy like that wouldn't last 10 minutes in the Velvet unless he was backed by somebody heavy, or he was too stupid to know he was walking into a meat grinder. Which one is your boy?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Sully took a hard right onto Jackson Street, throwing me against the door panel. "Well, watch your step, Harry. I hear Cavallo hired a new enforcer, guy out of Chicago, likes to use a heavy framing hammer, call it adjusting the balance sheet. Good to know. I'll make sure to wear a hard hat." Sully pulled over to the curb, the meter clicking loudly in the quiet cab. I handed him a dollar bill and told him to keep the change. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the neon sign of the Velvet Lounge buzzing angrily above my head. The V was burned out, so it read the Velvet Lounge, casting a sick, pinkish glow over the rain-slicked concrete. I pushed the heavy, brass-studded oak door open and stepped inside. The air in the joint was thick enough to chew, a suffocating mixture of cheap cigar smoke, spilled beer, and desperate perfume. The lighting was strictly dim, designed to hide the wrinkles on the patrons and the dirt on the floor. The wallpaper was a velvet flocking that might have been crimson once, but decades of smoke had turned it the color of dried blood. A jazz trio was tucked into a dark corner, murdering a Cole Porter tune with a lack of enthusiasm that bordered on criminal. I walked to the long mahogany bar. It was sticky under my hands. The bartender was a tall, skeletal man with a slicked-back pompadour and eyes that had seen far too many bar fights. He was polishing a highball glass with a rag that looked like it had been used to wipe a dipstick. "What's your poison?" he asked, not looking up. "Bourbon. Leave the bottle, and I need a little information." I laid a $5 bill on the damp wood. The bartender, his brass name tag read Deacon, stopped polishing. He looked at the fin, then slowly at me. "Bourbon is 50 cents. Information depends entirely on the question." He poured a generous measure of amber liquid into a heavy glass and set it down. I pushed the 5 closer to him. "I'm looking for a girl. Goes by Lola. Sings, maybe?" Deacon's expression closed tighter than a bank vault on a Sunday. "Lots of girls in Seattle. Lots of Lolas." I reached into my trench coat pocket, pulled out the crumpled photograph from the valise, and laid it face up next to the money. "This Lola." Deacon glanced at the photo. His jaw tightened just a fraction. It was a micro-expression, but in my business you learn to read the small print. "Don't know her," he lied, his voice flat and practiced. He reached for the $5 bill. I slammed my hand down on his wrist, pinning it hard to the sticky bar. His head snapped, his eyes flashing with sudden defensive violence. "Hey, pal, you better—" "The 5 is for the drink and the conversation," I interrupted, leaning in close so the lazy jazz trio covered my voice. "You want to earn it, you tell me about the girl, and the guy she's with. The guy in the glasses." Deacon glanced nervously toward a closed, reinforced door at the back of the room, the manager's office. "Look, buddy, I don't want any trouble. Trouble's already here, Deacon. The only question is whether you're going to be a speed bump or a bystander. Where is Lola?" Deacon swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his skinny throat. "She ain't here tonight. She only sings on Thursdays. She's got a place over on First Hill." "Where does she live, and who's the guy?" I don't know her address, I swear. She just comes in, does her set, and leaves with him. With Arthur? Or does she call him Richard? Deacon's eyes widened slightly. She calls him Dick. Look, that guy, he's bad news. He looks like a nobody, but he's tight with the clock. He manages the books for the back room. If you're looking for him, you're asking to get put in the ground. Cavallo is looking for him too, and Cavallo doesn't just ask questions. I let go of Deacon's wrist. He snatched his hand back immediately, rubbing the bone instinctively. Thanks, Deacon, you've been a pal. I pocketed the photograph and took a slow sip of the bourbon. It tasted like iodine and regret, burning a rough path down my throat. Arthur Sterling wasn't a kidnapped husband. He was a mob accountant who was skimming money from a ruthless boss, sleeping with a lounge singer, and hiding under the borrowed name of a dead man. Evelyn Sterling had played me an absolute fool. She knew exactly what her husband was up to, and she was pointing me right at the meat grinder while she stayed impeccably clean in her Broadmoor mansion. I set the glass on the sticky mahogany. It was time to pay Mrs. Sterling a visit and adjust the terms of our arrangement. The case hadn't just walked in. It had wrapped its hands around my throat, and it was starting to squeeze. Chapter 3. The Obvious Suspect. The rain had picked up its pace by the time I hit the pavement outside the Velvet Lounge, turning the Seattle streets into a slick black mirror reflecting the bruised neon signs. A cold wind whipped off Elliott Bay, cutting right through the wool of my trench coat like a cheap butcher's knife. I didn't care about the weather. I had a warm destination in mind. A place with manicured lawns, high hedges, and a woman who lied as naturally as she breathed. Broadmoor. I found a public phone booth half a block down, smelling faintly of stale urine and wet tobacco, and called Sully back. It took 3 rings before his gruff voice answered. Nile again? If you're calling to tell me you're dead, keep it brief. I'm eating a sandwich. Not yet, Sully. I need a chariot. Pick me up outside the Velvet. We're heading up to Broadmoor. Sully let out a low whistle through his teeth. Broadmoor. High society, huh? What'd you do? Inherit a fortune or lose your mind? A little of both. Just get the cab running. I'll be waiting. 10 minutes later, the yellow Plymouth pulled up to the curb with a wet slide of tires. I yanked the rear door open and slid inside, bringing a cloud of damp air and cigarette smoke with me. Sully shifted into drive, throwing a glance at me in the rearview mirror. He took in the damp fedora, the set of my jaw, and the way my hand was resting unconsciously near my shoulder holster. You look like a man who just found out Santa Claus is a mob enforcer, Sully remarked, pulling away from the curb. Worse, I said, staring out the streaked window at the blurring storefronts. I found out my client is the director of the play, and I'm just the prop getting smashed over the hero's head. Step on it, Sully. I've got a wealthy widow to educate. The drive to Broadmoor was like entering another country. Down in Pioneer Square, the city smelled of salt, sweat, and rotting dock timbers. Up here, it smelled of clipped hedges, wealth, and expensive cedar. The houses were massive, sprawling Tudors and colonials, set far back from the winding private streets, shielded from the working-class misery of the rest of Seattle by a high wrought iron fence and private security. Sully dropped me half a block from the Sterling estate. I paid him with a 5. Told him to keep the motor running and wait for my taillights, and walked the rest of the way on feet that felt like lead weights. The Sterling house was a grand 2-story brick colonial with white pillars and a slate roof that gleamed darkly in the rain. Every light on the ground floor was blazing, throwing warm, inviting squares of yellow across the wet grass. It looked like a picture out of a glossy magazine, safe, orderly, and entirely respectable. I didn't bother using the front doorbell. That was for process servers and insurance salesmen. I walked around the side, stepping quietly over a muddy flower bed, and headed toward the back patio where French doors opened onto a manicured garden. Through the glass I could see Evelyn Sterling. She wasn't weeping. She wasn't pacing the floor waiting for news of her missing, mild-mannered accountant husband. She was standing by a mahogany liquor cabinet, pouring herself a finger of what looked like very expensive scotch. She had changed out of her trench coat into a jade green silk dress that clung to her curves like a second skin. I raised my hand and rapped my knuckles sharply against the glass pane. Evelyn didn't jump. She didn't drop the glass. She paused, took a slow sip of her drink, and turned around. Her cool gray eyes locked onto mine through the rain-spattered glass. She set her glass down on the table, walked over, and unlatched the French door, pushing it open to let the damp night air wash into the warm room. "Mr. Nile," she said, her voice completely level, completely devoid of surprise. "You're dripping water all over my Persian rug. Come in before you catch your death." "Don't worry about the rug, Mrs. Sterling," I said, stepping past her into the living room. The heat from the fireplace hit me like a physical blow, baking the chill right out of my bones. "Given how this case is turning out, you're going to have much bigger redecorating problems by morning." I pulled off my sodden fedora, shook it out onto her expensive hardwood floor, and walked straight over to the fireplace to warm my hands. Evelyn closed the French door behind me, locking it with a sharp click. She walked back to the liquor cabinet, picked up her glass, and leaned casually against the polished wood. "You found something," she stated. It wasn't a question. "Oh, I found plenty," I said, turning to face her. I reached into my trench coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled black and white photograph I had lifted from the valise at King Street Station. I tossed it across the room. It landed face up on the coffee table right in front of her. Arthur Sterling, wire-rimmed glasses, nervous smile, sitting in a leather booth with a blonde bombshell in a sequin dress, her arm hooked through his. Evelyn looked down at the photograph. For a long second her face didn't move. Then, a slow, thin smile crept onto her lips. Not the polite, artificial smile she had worn in my office earlier, but something colder, sharper, and entirely genuine. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look heartbroken. She looked like a chess player watching her opponent walk straight into a well-laid trap. "Lola," Evelyn murmured, tracing the edge of the photograph with a manicured fingernail. "The little songbird from the Velvet Lounge. I wondered when you'd track her down." "You didn't just wonder, Mrs. Sterling. You mapped the route," I said, stepping closer, my hands shoved deep into my coat pockets. "Let's review the timeline, shall we? You walked into my office this afternoon claiming your mild-mannered, predictable accountant husband vanished on Tuesday morning. You played the distressed wife to the hilt, but you conveniently forgot to mention that the wallet you found behind a loose brick contained a baggage claim ticket stamped Thursday afternoon. People make mistakes with timelines under stress, Mr. Nile," she replied smoothly, taking another sip of her scotch. "People do, but professional liars don't make mistakes that are convenient. You didn't find that wallet Thursday. You knew exactly where it was. You knew about the valise at the train station. You knew about the ledger, and you damn well knew about Lola." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her gray eyes glinting in the firelight. "And if I did?" "If you did, then Arthur Sterling, or Richard Trent as he calls himself when he's down in Pioneer Square, didn't just vanish. He went into hiding, or someone helped him along." I narrowed my eyes, watching her expression like a hawk. "Arthur isn't just a bean counter for a legitimate firm downtown. He's been cooking the books for Leo the Clock Cavallo, skimming thousands of dollars right out from under a mob boss who doesn't use a calculator to settle his accounts. He uses a framing hammer. Arthur got greedy, took a lot of cash, and ran, and you hired me to find him." "Not to save him, Mr. Nile," Evelyn said softly, setting her glass down with a sharp clink. She pushed herself away from the liquor cabinet and walked toward me, stopping just a few feet away. The expensive perfume she wore filled the air again, but this time it didn't smell like luxury. It smelled like danger. To hunt him down, to flush him out into the open where Cavallo's boys can find him. "Why?" I asked. "If your husband is a thief and a deadbeat, why not just let him run? Why pay me $300 to act as a retriever dog for the West Seattle mob?" Evelyn let out a cold, humorless laugh. "Because, Mr. Nile, Arthur didn't just steal from Leo Cavallo. He stole from me." She walked over to a heavy mahogany desk against the far wall, unlocked a small drawer with a brass key, and pulled out a thick manila folder. She carried it back, opened it, and thrust a stack of legal documents into my chest. I pulled my hands out of my pockets and took them. I skimmed the pages under chandelier light. Bank statements, property titles, and promissory notes. 3 years ago, Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a harsh, bitter register, Arthur convinced me to invest my personal inheritance into a series of real estate developments down on the waterfront. He said it was a sure thing, safe dividends, steady growth. I trusted him. He was my husband. She spat the word out like a bad taste. It wasn't real estate. It was a front for Cavallo's loan sharking operation. Arthur used my family's money to finance the syndicate's capital. And when the books started bleeding last month, Arthur transferred the remaining assets into offshore accounts under his dead man alias, Richard Trent, and prepared to skip town with his little lounge singer. She looked straight up into my eyes, her face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He didn't just ruin my reputation, Mr. Nile. He stole every dime I owned. My father built this estate, and Arthur was going to leave me penniless so he could live the high life with a bleached blonde and a dive bar. I looked back down at the documents, then up at her. The picture was snapping into sharp, brutal focus. "So you didn't want him found so you could reconcile," I said quietly. "You wanted him found so you could claw your money back before Cavallo's enforcers put him in a pine box." "I want my money, Mr. Nile," Evelyn corrected sharply. "And if Arthur ends up in a pine box after he signs the transfer papers back over to me, that's just poetic justice. You're a private investigator. You find things that are lost. Consider my husband. Now, where is he?" I didn't answer right away. I walked over to the stone fireplace, staring down into the glowing embers as the rain continued to batter the French doors behind me. The room was warm, but the air felt heavy, charged with the kind of tension that usually precedes a gunshot. The pieces were all laid out on the table now. Arthur Sterling, the nervous accountant who wasn't an accountant at all. Richard Trent, the ghost on the docks. Leo Cavallo, the mobster with a ledger to balance. And Evelyn Sterling, the wronged wife who had turned herself into a cold-blooded predator to get her empire back. It was a classic triangle of greed, betrayal, and human misery. No supernatural curses, no masked masterminds, just ordinary people doing terrible things to each other for paper and coins. I turned back to face her, slipping the documents back into the folder and tossing it onto the coffee table. "I don't know where he is yet, Mrs. Sterling," I lied smoothly. "A good detective never shows all his cards to the house, especially when the house is playing with loaded dice. The trail leads to King Street Station, and Deacon at the Velvet Lounge gave me a breadcrumb, but finding a ghost who's running from both the mob and his vengeful wife takes a little time." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her gaze sharp as a razor. "Don't play games with me, Mr. Nile. I'm paying you well. You're paying me to investigate, not to perform miracles. And right now your timeline still has a hole in it." I picked up my fedora from the floor, shaking off the last drops of water, and jammed it onto my head. "You said you found that wallet behind the brick on Thursday afternoon, but the baggage claim ticket inside it was stamped Thursday at 2:15 p.m. at the station downtown. Unless your husband can teleport, he didn't leave that wallet behind before he skipped town. Someone else put it there." Evelyn froze. For a split second, the iron control in her posture wavered. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice dipping lower. "I'm saying someone else has been in this house, Mrs. Sterling. Someone who wants Arthur found just as badly as you do. Or maybe someone who wants to make sure you take the fall when Cavallo's boys finally catch up to him." I stepped past her toward the front foyer, my boots clicking sharply on the polished wood. "Mr. Nile," she called out, her voice hard and demanding, "where are you going?" "To find out who else is playing in your sandbox," I tossed over my shoulder. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped out into the pouring rain. The crisp, clean air of Broadmoor hit me like a splash of cold water. Down the winding, tree-lined lane, Sully's yellow Plymouth was idling patiently in the dark, its red taillights glowing like dying embers in the mist. I pulled my trench coat tight around my neck, jammed my hands into my pockets, and walked down the driveway. The case was getting crowded, the suspects were multiplying, and the body count was ticking closer by the minute. I had a feeling the next stop wasn't going to be a polite conversation in the living room. It was going to be in the dark, where the bullets fly straight and nobody asks for an ally. Chapter 4. Harry smells something off. The rain had settled into a steady gray drizzle by the time Sully's Plymouth rolled down from the manicured heights of Broadmoor and spat us back out into the greasy asphalt-slicked gutters of downtown Seattle. The streetlights flickered against the low-hanging fog, casting a jaundiced, sickly glow over the storefronts. I told Sully to drop me 2 blocks from my office on Yesler Way. A good detective doesn't advertise his return address, especially when he's carrying a head full of secrets and a pocket full of other people's dirty laundry. I walked the remaining distance with my hands jammed deep in my coat pockets, my boots making a wet, rhythmic slap-slap against the pavement. The city at night had a particular smell, a blend of wet coal smoke from the furnace stacks, the briny rot of the Elliott Bay tidelands, and the sharp, metallic tang of streetcar overhead wires buzzing in the damp air. It was a town built on timber and ambition, but right now, it felt like it was drowning in its own runoff. When I reached the brick building that housed my third-floor office, I paused in the recessed doorway to shake the water from my fedora. That was when I noticed it, small physical details. They're the things that nag at the back of your brain long after the big picture has stopped making sense, like a loose thread on a cheap suit that keeps pulling until the whole sleeve unravels. The latch on my office door upstairs was old, rusted, and notoriously stubborn. It required a specific, practiced upward heave of the brass knob to clear the warped jamb. As I stood at the foot of the dark, linoleum-lined staircase, listening to the rhythmic drip of a leaky gutter pipe outside, I remembered the sound of my door closing behind Evelyn Sterling earlier that afternoon. She hadn't heaved the knob, she hadn't jiggled it, she had simply pushed it, and it had clicked shut with the clean, smooth motion of a well-oiled mechanism. Except my door wasn't well-oiled. It hadn't been oiled since the Truman administration. I stopped with my right boot resting on the bottom step. My hand slid away from my pocket and drifted naturally toward the cold, checkered steel grip of the .38 snub nose resting in my shoulder holster. I didn't draw it, but I let my thumb brush the hammer just in case. I took the stairs 2 at a time, moving as quietly as a cat on a wool rug, my rubber-soled shoes muting the climb. The hallway on the 3rd floor was pitch black, lit only by the faint greenish hue of a neon sign bleeding through the frosted glass of the adjacent insurance office. My office door was shut. I leaned in close, pressing my ear against the cracked, flaking black paint of the lettering that read Harry Nile, Private Investigations. Silence. No clanking radiator, no scratching mice. Just the faint, distant hum of traffic down on 2nd Avenue and the steady patter of rain against the window pane. But there was something else in the air leaking out from the gap beneath the door. A scent. It wasn't the stale tobacco and damp wool I had left behind 3 hours ago. It was sharper, cleaner. A distinct, high-end floral perfume mixed with the faint, unmistakable trace of a Turkish cigarette. Evelyn Sterling's perfume. I reached out, wrapped my fingers around the brass doorknob, and gave it the familiar upward heave. It slipped open silently, the oil slicking the latch, speaking volumes. Someone had been here. Someone had brought a can of 3-in-1 oil and a professional touch to my tired little sanctuary. I pushed the door open with the toe of my shoe, stepping sideways into the room like a cop walking into a B-movie climax. "Don't turn on the lamp, Harry," a voice murmured from the shadows near the filing cabinet. "The glare ruins the atmosphere." It was her, Evelyn Sterling. She was sitting in the wooden visitor's chair opposite my desk, the exact same chair she had perched on earlier. Only this time, she looked entirely relaxed. The tense, aristocratic posture was gone. She had her legs crossed at the ankle, and in the dim amber light spilling in from the street lamp outside, I could see she was holding something in her gloved hand, a silver cigarette lighter. It clicked open, flared with a bright yellow tongue of flame, and she lit another one of her long, slender cigarettes. The flare briefly illuminated the sharp, cold angles of her face and the calculating glint in her gray eyes. "You know, Mrs. Sterling," I said, letting the door click shut behind me and keeping my weight balanced on the balls of my feet. "Breaking and entering into a private investigator's office is a great way to get a bullet through your expensive silk dress, especially when you've already paid for my services." She blew a plume of smoke toward the ceiling fan, watching it disperse into the gray gloom. "Oh, stop playing the hard-boiled Avenger, Mr. Nile. It's past 4 in the afternoon, and frankly, your office lacks an adequate cocktail bar. I let myself in with a spare key. A girl has to pass the time while she waits for her employee to stop wandering around the waterfront." "An employee who was out tracking down your missing, embezzling husband," I said, walking slowly toward my desk, keeping my eyes locked on hers. I didn't sit down. "Let's talk about that spare key, Evelyn. How did you get it?" "People who pay retainers often acquire privileges," she said smoothly, leaning back in the chair with an air of absolute ownership. "People who pay retainers get information when I'm good and ready to give it," I countered, stopping just short of the desk. "Not before, and they certainly don't sneak into my office to oil my door hinges and go through my files." Evelyn didn't flinch. She took a slow drag of her cigarette, the tip glowing a hot, angry crimson in the dark. "Your files, Mr. Nile. You mean empty coffee mugs and unpaid gas bills. I didn't come here to steal your billing records. I came here to see if you were actually earning your $300, or if you were just blowing smoke like every other two-bit gumshoe on Yesler Way. And did you find what you were looking for? I found that you've been busy, she said, her voice dropping a fraction, losing its conversational polish and taking on a hard, pragmatic edge. You went to King Street Station. You found the valise. You talked to Deacon at the Velvet Lounge. You even managed to track down a photograph of my charming, faithless husband with his little musical mistress. I narrowed my eyes. You've been watching me. That cab that was parked 3 cars down from the Velvet? That wasn't an accident. Nothing in my life is an accident, Mr. Nile. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, bringing her face closer to the faint light. Arthur is slippery. He always has been. He looks like a man who gets pushed around by grocery clerks, but when it comes to numbers, he has the survival instincts of a rat in a sinking ship. If you found the valise, that means you know about the ledger. And if you know about the ledger, you know how much money he took from Leo Cavallo. And from you, I added. Yes, from me. She stood, smoothing the front of her jade green silk dress with a gloved hand. She was taller than she looked sitting down, carrying herself with the frozen grace of a woman who had spent a lifetime navigating high society boardrooms where a single wrong word could cost a fortune. She walked around the corner of the desk, stopping just inches away from me. The scent of her expensive perfume was overpowering now, masking the smell of my stale tobacco and cheap bourbon. Which brings us to the real reason I'm standing in this dismal little room waiting for you in the dark, she whispered, her gray eyes boring straight into mine. Which is, you're dragging your feet, Harry. She used my first name for the first time, and it sounded less like a name and more like a warning. You told me you needed time to find him, but I didn't hire you to take a scenic tour of Seattle's seedier drinking holes. I hired you to deliver him, or at the very least, to deliver the offshore account numbers he hid in that ledger. I didn't move an inch. I could feel the heat radiating off her, contrasting sharply with the cold dampness seeping through the brick walls of the building. If Arthur has those account numbers tucked away, Mrs. Sterling, they aren't written in plain English, I said, keeping my voice low and level. And they certainly aren't sitting in my desk drawer. Cavallo is looking for him. The cops are looking for a dead man's ghost, and your husband is running for the county line. If I push too hard, too fast, I'm not going to catch an accountant. I'm going to catch a bullet. And I'm picky about where I put my holes. Evelyn stared at me for a long, silent moment. The only sound in the room was the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the rain against the window pane and the distant clank of the radiator trying to pump life into rusted pipes. Slowly, a small, cold smile touched the corners of her painted lips. She reached into her handbag, the sleek, dark leather number with the silver clasp, and pulled out a second envelope. It was thicker than the first one. She laid it gently on the scarred wood of my desk, right on top of a stack of unpaid electric bills. There's another $500 in there, Mr. Nile, she said softly, her fingers lingering on the corner of the heavy paper. In crisp, unmarked 50s. No questions asked, no receipts given. I looked down at the envelope, then back up at her face. You've got a lot of cash lying around the house for a woman whose husband supposedly cleaned out her entire fortune. A smart woman never keeps all her eggs in one basket, Mr. Nile. Especially when she knows the man holding the basket is a fool. She stepped back, pulling her gloves tighter over her fingers. Find Arthur, find the ledger, and bring me those account numbers by noon tomorrow. Because if you don't, I promise you Leo Cavallo's enforcer won't just break your office door, he'll break your legs. She didn't wait for an answer. She turned on her heel, her footsteps clicking sharply against the linoleum floor as she walked out into the hallway. The door swung shut behind her, the newly oiled latch clicking softly into place. I stood there in the dark office for a long time, listening to the silence settle back over the room. I reached out, picked up the thick envelope, and flipped it open with my thumb. A neat stack of $50 bills stared back at me, smelling faintly of bank paper and ink. $500. Generous, too generous. I walked over to the window and pushed the dusty wooden sash open an inch, letting the cool, damp Seattle air wash over my face. Down on the street below, a sleek black Packard sedan, the kind of car that didn't belong in Pioneer Square unless it was collecting protection money or dropping off a corpse, was idling quietly against the curb, its headlights switched off in the mist. As I watched, the passenger door opened. A man stepped out into the rain and looked straight up toward my third-floor window. Even through the distorted glass and the sheets of falling water, I could see the broad shoulders, the heavy overcoat, and the unmistakable shape of a framing hammer tucked casually into a belt loop. Leo Cavallo's new enforcer from Chicago. I let the window sash drop back down with a sharp thud. I pulled a Chesterfield from my pocket, struck a match against the underside of the desk, and lit it, watching the gray smoke curl lazily toward the inactive ceiling fan. Evelyn Sterling hadn't just been checking up on me. She had been leading the opposition right to my front door. She wanted Arthur found, yes, but she wanted him found by everyone at the same time, turning the city into a firing range where the last man standing would be the one holding the cash. The timeline didn't just have a hole in it anymore. The whole damn bridge was collapsing. And I was standing right in the middle of the span, waiting for the weight to drop. I reached for the telephone, picked up the heavy black receiver, and dialed a number I hoped would give me a fighting chance before the morning paper hit the stands. It was time to pull another thread and see how fast the whole bloody sweater unraveled. Chapter 5. The timeline doesn't hold. The rain had settled into a steady gray drizzle that coated the Seattle pavements like a fresh layer of machine oil. Down on Yesler Way, the streetlights flickered against the low-hanging fog, casting a jaundiced, sickly glow over the storefronts. I was sitting at my desk, the ashtray overflowing with crushed Chesterfield butts, staring at the $500 Evelyn Sterling had left behind like a down payment on a tombstone. A good detective doesn't just look at what people tell him. He looks at the gaps between the sentences. And Evelyn's story was riddled with more holes than a Swiss cheese left out in front of a firing squad. She had given me a neat, tidy narrative. Her mild-mannered accountant husband, Arthur, had vanished on Tuesday morning, taking her family's fortune and a mobster's ledger with him. She claimed she discovered the wallet hidden behind the brick Thursday, but the baggage claim ticket tucked inside that wallet was stamped Thursday afternoon at 2:15 at King Street Station. Unless Arthur possessed the miraculous ability to be in two places at once, or to plant evidence in his own home after he was already missing, the timeline was completely upside down. I leaned back, letting the springs of my chair groan in protest, and pulled out the small, crumpled notepad where I scribbled down my notes. It was time to reconstruct the puzzle piece by piece, starting from the moment Arthur Sterling supposedly walked out of his Broadmoor front door on Tuesday morning. Let's look at the cab fares, the phone logs, and the closing times. According to Evelyn, Arthur left the house at 8:15 a.m., dressed in his usual conservative suit, carrying his standard leather briefcase, heading for his office on 4th Avenue. But when I checked with the firm downtown the previous afternoon, using a fictitious name and a gruff tone that implied I was from the state tax board, I learned something interesting. Arthur hadn't shown up for work on Tuesday. In fact, he hadn't shown up since the previous Friday. That meant he had been playing hooky for nearly 4 days before his wife supposedly noticed he was missing. 4 days is a long time in the underworld. It's enough time to launder $10,000, arrange a fake passport, or get yourself buried under a concrete foundation down by the industrial docks. I struck a match, lit another cigarette, and dragged the smoke deep into my lungs. If Arthur wasn't in his office Tuesday morning, where was he? More importantly, who saw him leave? I picked up the heavy black receiver of my desk phone, dialed the operator, and asked to be connected to a number I had pulled from a telephone log I'd lifted off a contact at the local exchange earlier that week. It was a private line belonging to an apartment building in the Cascade neighborhood, a drab 3-story walk-up wedged between a laundry and a radiator repair shop. The line rang 4 times before a gruff, sleepy voice answered. "Yeah? Who's this?" "It's the middle of the night, for Christ's sake." "Sorry to wake you up, pal," I said, pitching my voice to sound like a weary bill collector. "I'm looking for the super, name of Higgins." "You're talking to him. What do you want?" "I'm checking on apartment 3B, registered to a Mr. Richard Trent. I'm with the utility company. We got a report of a gas leak warning light tripping on his meter, and I need to know if he's home to grant access." There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line, accompanied by the rustle of bedsheets and the unmistakable scratch of a match lighting a cheap cigar. "Trent?" the super grunted, coughing wetly into the mouthpiece. "You're wasting your trip, buddy. That guy hasn't been back to 3B since Monday night." My posture stiffened instantly. The chair stopped groaning. "Monday night? You're sure about that?" "I'm as sure as I am that my knees hurt when it rains," Higgins snapped. "I saw him carrying a heavy valise down the stairs around 10 p.m. Monday." He looked over his shoulder like he was expecting the FBI to jump out of the laundry chute. He climbed into a gray sedan that was idling outside. Didn't look like his usual style either. Fancy car. Looked like a Packard. A Packard. Just like the one I saw idling outside my office window after Evelyn left. "Did he say where he was going?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "He didn't say boo to me. He just jammed a $10 bill into my shirt pocket, mumbled something about a long trip, and walked out into the rain. Ain't seen him since. Now, are you gonna fix that gas meter or just keep asking stupid questions?" "We're taking care of it right now, Higgins. Go back to sleep." I slammed the receiver back onto the cradle. The timeline didn't just have a hole in it. It was a complete fabrication from top to bottom. Evelyn Sterling told me her husband disappeared Tuesday morning from their home in Broadmoor, but the super at the Cascade apartment building swore Arthur, living under his alias Richard Trent, left his hideout on Monday night, carrying a valise and getting into a luxury Packard. That meant Arthur hadn't disappeared from his home on Tuesday at all. He had abandoned his secret downtown apartment nearly 12 hours before his wife claimed he went missing for work. Which meant Evelyn knew about the double life long before Tuesday morning. She knew about Richard Trent, she knew about the apartment, and she was lying about the exact moment her husband dropped off the radar to steer my investigation away from the truth. I stood up, pacing the narrow length of my office, my boots grinding against the gritty linoleum floor. The smoke from my cigarette drifted through the shaft of amber light cutting across the room. Why lie about a 12-hour window? What difference does a single night make in the grand scheme of a mob embezzlement scheme? Unless Arthur didn't flee Monday night because he was scared of Leo Cavallo, or at least not just Cavallo. I walked over to the wooden coat rack, grabbed my sodden fedora and jammed it onto my head. I slipped my trench coat back on, checking the weight of the .38 revolver against my ribs. I needed to retrace Arthur's actual movements, not the fairy tale Evelyn had spun for me over a glass of expensive scotch, but the cold, hard trail he left behind when he packed that valise on Monday night. 10 minutes later, I was standing on the wet sidewalk outside the Cascade apartment building, the rain plastering my hair against my forehead. The building was dark, save for a single amber bulb glowing above the front stoop like a warning beacon. I didn't bother ringing the super's bell. Instead, I checked the side alley, a narrow, trash-choked strip of concrete running between the laundry shop and the brick wall of the apartments. Most cheap apartment buildings in Seattle have a back fire escape that's either rusted open or held together with a prayer. This one was held together with rust and bad intentions. I grabbed the bottom rung of the iron ladder, pulled myself up, and hauled my weight onto the first landing. The metal groaned under my boots, protesting the sudden intrusion. I climbed up to the second floor, moving with the cautious, deliberate steps of a man who knew that a single squeak could bring a bullet through a window. Apartment 3B was located at the very end of the metal walkway. The window was dark, covered by a heavy green vinyl shade that was pulled down tight, leaving a sliver of space at the bottom where a faint gray light spilled out onto the concrete. I stepped up to the door. The wood was cheap, painted a dull hospital green that was peeling away in damp curls. I didn't knock. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a small leather case containing a set of tension wrenches and a slim steel pick, and went to work on the latch. In my line of work, you learn a few trades that don't look good on a resume. Opening a cheap Yale lock takes about as much time as lighting a cigarette if you've got steady fingers and a little patience. Click. The lock gave way with a soft metallic sigh. I pushed the door open just an inch, waiting to see if the air inside smelled of stale fear or something worse. Nothing, just the stagnant chill of a room that hadn't seen a breath of fresh air in 3 days. I slipped inside, closing the door softly behind me, and clicked on a small penlight I kept in my pocket. The beam cut through the gloom, dancing across the cramped interior of the apartment. It was a bachelor's cell. A narrow cot shoved against the wall with the blankets thrown back in a frantic heap. A small wooden table covered in empty coffee cups, crumpled paper napkins, and a scatter of handwritten financial ledgers. A single metal wardrobe with its door hanging wide open. Empty hangers swinging gently in the draft from the hallway. Arthur Sterling, alias Richard Trent, had packed in a hurry. But he hadn't packed like a man running from a mob boss. He had packed like a man who knew he was being hunted by a ghost. I walked over to the table, sweeping the beam of my penlight across the financial papers. These weren't Cavallo's loan-sharking ledgers. These were personal bank statements, insurance policies, and stock certificates bearing Evelyn Sterling's maiden name. I flipped through them, my eyebrows pulling together as I read the fine print. Arthur hadn't been skimming money from Cavallo to fund a lavish lifestyle with a blonde lounge singer named Lola. At least, not entirely. According to these statements, Arthur had been systematically liquidating his wife's private trust fund for the past 6 months, transferring the funds out of Broadmoor accounts and funneling them into a blind trust managed by an offshore shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. And who was the primary beneficiary listed on that offshore trust? Not Arthur Sterling, not Richard Trent, Evelyn Sterling herself. I stopped breathing for a second. The penlight shook slightly in my hand. I stared down at the paper, the numbers staring back at me with cold, mathematical precision. Evelyn hadn't been robbed by her husband. She hadn't been left penniless and desperate. She and Arthur had set up the entire scheme together. It was an insurance and asset protection scam designed to siphon millions out of her family's estate and Leo Cavallo's syndicate simultaneously, hiding the capital behind a web of fake identities and dead men's names before staging Arthur's dramatic disappearance. The missing husband, the embezzled mob funds, the fake wallet behind the brick, the dramatic visit to my office. It was all an elaborate stage play. Evelyn wasn't the wronged wife seeking justice. She was the architect of the whole operation. So why hire me? Why pay $300, plus another $500 in a thick envelope, to hunt down her own co-conspirator? Because somewhere along the way, the plan had gone off the rails. Arthur had taken the valise, the gun, and the real ledger, and he had decided to cut Evelyn out of the final payout. He was planning to run off to Mexico or South America with Lola, leaving his brilliant ice-cold wife holding an empty bag and facing the full wrath of Leo Cavallo's framing hammer. Evelyn didn't want her husband found so she could get her money back. She wanted him found so she could eliminate the only loose end that could send her to the electric chair or put her in a shallow grave down by the docks. Suddenly, every instinct I possessed screamed at the top of its lungs. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. It wasn't the building settling. It wasn't the wind rattling the fire escape. It was the distinct, heavy, deliberate tread of a man wearing hard-soled leather shoes, moving with the practiced, silent rhythm of a professional predator. I snapped off my penlight, plunging the room into absolute darkness. I drew the .38 snub nose from my shoulder holster, the steel cold and reassuring against my palm. I slipped sideways behind the heavy velvet window drape, pressing my back flat against the cold plaster wall beside the door. The doorknob turned, slowly, quietly. The door pushed inward, swinging open with a faint whisper of air. A broad silhouette filled the frame, backlit by the greenish neon glow of the hallway light. Even in the shadows, I recognized the heavy overcoat and the thick, unmistakable handle of a framing hammer dangling casually from a gloved hand. Leo Cavallo's enforcer from Chicago had finally caught up to the trail, and he wasn't here to demand an audit. Chapter 6: The Secret Life. The room smelled of stale radiator iron and cold tea. In the dark, every sound had a knife edge. The man in the doorway didn't rush. Amateurs rush. They kick doors off hinges and yell warnings they live to regret. Professionals take their time knowing the shadows are already on their side. He stepped over the threshold with the fluid, heavy grace of a heavyweight fighter who had spent 10 years learning how to break ribs without losing his breath. His overcoat brushed the peeling green frame of apartment 3B, and the faint, unmistakable reek of wet wool and cheap menthols drifted across the narrow floorboards. I kept my back glued to the lath and plaster wall behind the window drape, the damp velvet heavy against my cheek. My right hand held the .38 snub nose steady, the hammer back half an inch, my thumb dry despite the sweat slicking my palm. If he turned left toward the cot, he'd see the silhouette of my shoes against the gray oblong of the window shade light. If he turned right toward the table, he'd find the empty coffee cups and the ledger copies Arthur had left behind like breadcrumbs for a blind pig. He turned right. A floorboard groaned, a dry, high-pitched squeak that sounded like a dry bone snapping in half. He froze instantly. Not a muscle twitched. I could hear him breathing through his nose, long and slow, listening for the return echo of his own weight. "I know you're in the pocket, pal," a voice rumbled out of the dark. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, gravel-scraping rasp that sounded like it had been dragged across 40 miles of gravel highway. "The super ain't bright, but he doesn't miss a Plymouth idling 3 doors down with the heater blowing exhaust into the alley. You're tracking a cold scent, and the trail's about to freeze over permanently." The Chicago enforcer. The guy Sully called the balance sheet adjuster. I didn't answer. Silence is a cheaper commodity than talk, and it's a lot harder to trace back to your office. He took another slow step forward, his heavy shoe heel coming down with a dull thud against the linoleum. I heard the scrape of paper. He was fingering the financial statements Arthur had left scattered across the wooden table. "Smart little beaver, this Trent," the enforcer muttered to himself, the sound thick with disgust. "Keeps his books neat. Figures a man can hide behind a dead man's tombstone forever if he just changes his handwriting enough times. But numbers don't lie, mister, and when the bottom line doesn't match the cash drawer, Leo Cavallo doesn't send an auditor. He sent it to me." "Then you must be late for your appointment," I said, stepping out from behind the velvet drape. The penlight in my left hand flicked on, blindingly bright, and jammed straight into his eyes. He didn't flinch like a deer in the headlights. He brought his left forearm up in a lightning-fast arc to swat the beam aside, while his right hand, the one holding the heavy framing hammer, whipped upward with the speed of a striking rattler. The iron head of the hammer whistled past my ear so close it parted the hair on my temple and took a chunk out of the plaster behind me with a dry crack. I didn't try to play the hero. I stepped inside his reach before he could cycle the heavy tool for a second swing, driving the butt of my .38 straight into his solar plexus with all the frustration I'd accumulated since Evelyn Sterling walked into my office. The enforcer let out a sharp, explosive oof, the sound of 200 pounds of gristle and beef losing its air supply all at once. He staggered backward, his heavy overcoat swirling around his shins like a black wing, and slammed hard against the metal wardrobe. The door flew open with a metallic crash, and he slid down onto the floor, his knees drawn up, his face gray in the penlight's glare. The framing hammer slipped from his gloved fingers and clattered onto the linoleum, rolling until it bumped against my boot. I leaned down, planted the tip of my shoe firmly on his wrist, and kept the muzzle of the snub nose pointed right between his broad, damp eyebrows. "You're out of your jurisdiction, friend," I said, my voice as flat and cold as a slab of meat in a butcher's cooler. "Seattle police don't usually like Chicago tourists carrying trade tools without a permit." He wheezed once, twice, sucking air back into his lungs with a wet, rattling sound, before looking up at me through hooded, bloodshot eyes. A thin, grim smile touched the corner of his bruised mouth. "You think this is about Cavallo's ledger, don't you?" He wheezed, his voice sounding like sandpaper on oak. "You think the little bean counter just dipped his hand into the boss's cigar box and ran off to buy a ranch in Mexico?" "That's the story the widow told me," I said, shifting my weight on his wrist, just enough to let him know I wasn't running an information booth. "Arthur Sterling took 20 grand of mob money and 50 grand of his wife's inheritance, traded his name for a dead man's tombstone, and skipped town with a blonde singer." The enforcer let out a low, hacking laugh that turned into a cough. "The widow, yeah, Mrs. High and Mighty Broadmoor herself. You're buying her brand of hooch, Nile? She didn't lose her inheritance, she spent it. She financed the whole damn syndicate expansion 2 years ago, when the banks wouldn't touch her family's timber holdings. Arthur wasn't skimming from Cavallo. He was the only reason Cavallo didn't foreclose on her mansion 6 months ago." I felt a cold drop of sweat trickle down the back of my neck, completely unrelated to the damp heat of the room. "Keep talking. You're getting to the interesting part." "There ain't no secret life, pal," the enforcer spat, wiping a streak of gray phlegm from his lip. "Arthur wasn't hiding from the mob because he stole from us. He was hiding from her because he found out what she was planning to do with the insurance policy she took out on his life 3 months before he vanished." The world in that small, damp room seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Insurance, a policy taken 3 months ago. I remembered Evelyn's face when she sat in my office, cool, composed, not a single tear in her eye, offering $50 a day plus a $200 bonus to find a man she claimed she hadn't seen since Tuesday morning. She hadn't wanted Arthur brought back to save their marriage or to recover stolen funds. She had wanted him found so he could be executed by proxy before the 60-day contestability clause on her $1 million indemnity policy expired. If a man goes missing and is declared legally dead under suspicious circumstances, say fleeing with mob money, the payout takes years through probate. But if he's found dead with a Chicago mobster's hammer in his skull, the coroner signs off on a gangland rubout, the policy triggers immediately, and the grieving widow collects every red cent free and clear of federal audit. The lady's got expensive tastes, Nile, the enforcer wheezed, shifting his weight painfully against the wardrobe. And she doesn't like loose ends. Arthur figured it out when he saw the paperwork for the policy in her private safe. That's why he grabbed the ledger, took the dead man's name, and ran like hell. He wasn't running from me, he was running from her. I pulled my shoe off his wrist, stepped back, and slipped the .38 back into my shoulder holster. I didn't have to ask anymore. The puzzle was complete, and every single piece was rotten to the core. "Where is he?" I asked quietly. The enforcer looked up at me, his eyes dark and mocking. "You think I'd tell a two-bit gumshoe like you? He's smarter than both of us. He's got a ticket out on the midnight freighter docked down at Pier 41, heading north to Alaska. If you want to stop shipping, you better run fast. But I'll tell you one thing, Nile. The lady's already got a car waiting at the end of the slip, and she ain't bringing flowers." I didn't waste another second. I turned on my heel, bolted through the open door of apartment 3B, and took the fire escape stairs 3 at a time, the iron rungs screaming under my boots as I hit the alley below. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the gutters into rushing brown streams of oil and autumn leaves. I hit the sidewalk and started running toward the waterfront, my lungs burning with every breath of damp, coal-scented air. The secret life wasn't Arthur's. It was the whole damn city, wrapped in silk, perfumed with expensive French flowers, and weighted down with cold, heavy iron. I had a freight train to catch, a dead man's name to clear, and a cold-blooded widow to beat to the docks. Just another Friday night in Seattle. Chapter 7. The Detail That Won't Die. Pier 41 looked like the edge of the world, a rotting finger of wood and iron pointing out into the black, churning void of Elliott Bay. The rain had intensified into a cold, driving deluge that hammered against the corrugated metal rooftops of the dockside warehouses, creating a deafening roar that drowned out everything but the frantic thud of my own heart. The air here didn't just smell of coal and salt. It tasted of iron, grease, and the kind of damp, suffocating finality that you only find at the end of a long, bad night. I didn't have a car, and Sully had long since given up on me, likely figuring that if I wasn't back in 15 minutes, I was either collecting a fee or a coroner's tag. I covered the last 3 blocks at a dead run, my breath hitching in my chest, my trench coat flapping behind me like the wings of a dying crow. Every shadow in the loading yards looked like a man with a framing hammer. Every gust of wind felt like a warning. The detail that wouldn't die, the one that had been scratching at the back of my brain since I first stepped into that office on Yesler Way, wasn't the insurance policy, or the mob money, or the double identity. It was a matchbook, the black and gold matchbook from the Velvet Lounge. When I first looked at it in my office, there were 3 matches missing. I'd thought it was just a throwaway clue, a sign of a nervous habit, a quick smoke in a quiet corner. But as I sprinted past the towering stacks of shipping crates toward the flickering masthead lights of the freighter northbound Star, it hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Arthur Sterling, or Richard Trent, didn't smoke. Evelyn had told me her husband was a man who wouldn't even think of infidelity, a man so predictable he wore suspenders and a belt. A man who, she said, did not have the imagination for anything more daring than a tax audit. And yet the ledger I'd pulled from the valise at King Street Station, the one with the names, the dates, the numbers, had been sitting right next to that matchbook. If Arthur didn't smoke, who did? Who had been using the matches? The answer was so obvious it was blinding. I didn't need to be a genius. I just needed to look at the woman standing in the shadow of a rusted crane at the end of the pier. She was leaning against the cold, wet steel, smoking a long, slender cigarette. She wasn't wearing her trench coat anymore. She was wrapped in a heavy, fur-collared parka that looked like it had been pulled from a department store mannequin. And she was holding a small, silver-plated pistol, a dainty little thing that looked like jewelry, but could tear a man's heart out if held by a steady hand. Evelyn Sterling. She wasn't looking at the northbound Star. She was looking at a dark, nondescript sedan parked 20 yards away, its engine idling with a low, throaty rumble that vibrated through the wet wood of the pier. I slowed my pace, dropping into a crouch behind a towering wall of cedar crates. My wet boots skidded on the oily planks, but I caught myself, leaning against the rough wood, my hand hovering near my shoulder holster. She wasn't waiting for the police. She wasn't waiting for Cavallo. She was waiting for the final act of her own play. A figure emerged from the darkness of the gangplank, a man in a cheap, rumpled wool coat, his head pulled down low against the rain. He was carrying a single battered leather suitcase. It was Arthur. Even from 20 yards away I could recognize that nervous, slightly hunched walk, the way he hesitated before every step, looking around with the terrified eyes of a man who knew he was being stalked. He was walking toward the idling sedan, clearly expecting a ride to safety, a contact he'd made, or perhaps he thought the car belonged to the captain of the freighter. He reached the door, his hand fumbling for the handle. Evelyn stepped out of the crane's shadow. She didn't call his name. She didn't scream or demand her money back. She just stood there, the orange tip of her cigarette glowing in the dark, the silver pistol held at her side with the casual, terrifying grace of a queen watching a pauper drown. "Going somewhere, Arthur?" The voice was cool, clear, and cut through the roar of the rain like a razor blade. Arthur jumped, the suitcase dropping from his hand and hitting the wet pier with a dull thud. He spun around, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the faint, yellow spill of light from the dockside masthead. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely terrified. "Evelyn," he gasped, his voice cracking. I was going to call you. I was going to explain." "Explain?" Evelyn took a slow, measured step forward, the water dripping off the edge of her parka hood. "You've been explaining yourself for 6 months, Arthur. The ledger, the offshore accounts, the little songbird at the Velvet. I think we're done with explanations." "I did it for us," Arthur pleaded, backing away until his heels hit the edge of the pier. Behind him, the black water of Elliott Bay churned against the wooden pilings, an unforgiving, cold abyss. "I did it so we could be free. So we could get away from Cavallo. I was bringing the money back to you." "You were bringing the money back to me?" Evelyn let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "You were bringing it back to a bank account in the Caymans that didn't have my name on it. You were bringing it back to a life that didn't have me in it." She raised the pistol. It wasn't shaking. It was as steady as a rock. "Wait!" I yelled, pulling my .38 and stepping out from behind the crates, my voice straining to be heard over the wind. "Drop it, Evelyn! It's over!" Evelyn didn't even turn her head. She just kept the gun pointed directly at her husband's chest. "You're late, Mr. Nile," she said, her voice dripping with bored indifference. "I expected you to be here an hour ago. You're really quite terrible at your job." "I'm not here to work for you," I said, moving forward, the gun held firmly in both hands, my boots crunching on the wet wood. "I'm here to close the case, the insurance policy, the framing, the whole rotten act. The police are already on their way." "The police?" Evelyn looked over her shoulder, a thin, cruel smile dancing on her lips. "With what evidence, Harry? Word of a private eye with a drinking problem. A mob enforcer from Chicago who doesn't exist on any official record. My husband is a thief who was embezzled from a mob boss. If he ends up in the Bay, the only thing the police are going to find is a closed file and a grieving widow." "They'll find the ledger," I said, my voice steady, my eyes locked on the tiny trembling finger she had curled around the trigger. "The real one. The one you didn't know he kept in the lining of that suitcase. The one that links your family's timber estate to every penny of Cavallo's dirty money. That isn't just an embezzlement case. That's a federal tax warrant on the whole Sterling Empire." For the first time, the mask slipped. Her eyes widened, just for a fraction of a second, and she flicked a glance at the battered suitcase lying in the rain at Arthur's feet. It was all the hesitation I needed. I didn't aim for her head, and I didn't aim for the gun. I aimed for the concrete piling she was standing next to, pulling the trigger twice in rapid succession. Crack, crack, the bullets whizzed past her, shattering the wood and concrete right beside her hip, sending a spray of splinters and dust into her face. She screamed, a raw, high-pitched sound of pure, unadulterated shock, and reflexively jerked her arm away. The silver pistol flew from her hand, skittering across the wet boards before clattering into the dark, churning water of the bay with a hollow plop. Arthur scrambled forward, diving toward the suitcase and clutching it to his chest like a holy relic. Evelyn stood there for a heartbeat, her hands trembling, her face twisted in a mask of pure, murderous rage. She looked at me, then at the water where her gun had vanished, and then at the dark sedan parked nearby. She turned and bolted. She didn't run toward the sedan. She ran toward the darkness of the shipping containers, moving with the desperate, jagged speed of a cornered animal. "Stay here," I barked at Arthur, who was still cowering on the pier, the suitcase pressed against his soaking suit jacket. I didn't wait for him to respond. I took off after her, my legs burning, my vision blurring in the rain. I hit the alley between the warehouses just as she was rounding the corner toward the industrial access road. I cut the angle, jumping over a pallet of empty shipping crates, and hit the asphalt just as she was reaching the passenger door of a second unmarked car that had pulled up to the curb. Not the sedan from before, but a beat-up, black city police cruiser. A man in a plain suit stepped out of the driver's side, a guy I recognized from the peripheral blur of Central Precinct hallways, a detective named Henderson. "Nile!" Henderson yelled, his hand on his holster. "Back off! We've got this!" Evelyn was already reaching for the door handle, a look of triumphant relief on her face. "Detective, thank God! This man is trying to kill us!" I slowed down, panting, the rain drenching me to the bone. I looked at Henderson, then at Evelyn, and I realized with a sickening cold clarity that the rot in this city went all the way to the top. The police cruiser wasn't here to arrest her. They were here to pick up the principal player and escort her back to the Broadmoor mansion before the morning light could expose the mess. I didn't reach for my gun. I reached into my trench coat pocket, pulled out the crumpled matchbook from the velvet lounge, and held it up. "Detective," I shouted, my voice cutting through the rain. "You might want to check the back seat of that cruiser. I left a little something there for you, a gift from the Chicago enforcer." Henderson hesitated, his hand lingering on the doorknob. It was a bluff, a desperate, last-ditch lie that hung in the air like a desperate prayer. But it worked. He glanced back toward the cruiser, and in that split second, the air was torn apart by the shrill, piercing wail of a siren. Not from one direction, but three. Police cruisers, real ones, with sirens screaming and red lights flashing, turned the corner from the main boulevard, blocking the access road and lighting up the pier like a stage set. It was the morning watch, the real morning watch, headed by someone who actually gave a damn about the badge. Evelyn Sterling stood on the sidewalk, frozen, her face drained of all color, her hands dropping to her sides as the squad cars swarmed the area. I stood there, soaked, shivering, and exhausted, as the reality of the night finally settled in. The case was closed, the ledger was secured. The widow was in irons. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the final Chesterfield, and found that the matchbook was empty. I didn't care. I lit it on the glowing red emergency light of the nearest cruiser, took a long, hard drag, and walked back toward the pier. Nothing really fixed. But at least for tonight, the rain felt a little bit cleaner. The morning didn't break over Seattle, it just sort of leaked into existence. The sky shifted from a deep, suffocating charcoal to a bruised, watery gray. The rain, which had hammered the city with the relentless monotony of a telegraph key, finally slowed to a persistent, irritating mist. I was sitting in the back of a black and white squad car, shivering in clothes that felt like they were woven out of lead and misery. The heater was pumping, but it was just circulating the smell of wet upholstery and stale precinct coffee. Across from me, Evelyn Sterling sat with the straight-backed, unyielding posture of a woman who was still mentally balancing a ledger. She didn't look like a woman facing a murder-for-hire charge, or a racketeering indictment, or the total collapse of her family's timber empire. She looked like she was waiting for a delayed flight at SeaTac, annoyed by the incompetence of the ground crew. "You think this is a victory, don't you, Mr. Nile?" she said, her voice soft, devoid of the frantic edge it had held on the pier. She didn't look at me. She stared out the fogged glass at the gray silhouettes of the waterfront warehouses. "You think you've uncovered a grand conspiracy, a rot at the heart of the city. You're such a romantic." I didn't answer. I leaned my head against the cool metal of the doorframe and watched the city go by. My lungs felt like they were filled with wet sand, and the adrenaline that had kept me running for the last 48 hours had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, aching fatigue that went all the way to my marrow. "There is no grand conspiracy," she continued, her fingers tracing the seam of her mink-lined parka. "There is only leverage. Arthur was leveraged. Cavallo was leveraged. The insurance company was leveraged. You played your part perfectly, Harry. You did exactly what I paid you to do. You found the man, you unearthed the ledger, and you brought the house of cards crashing down. The only thing you didn't realize was that the house was already designed to fall. You wanted him dead, I said, my voice sounding like gravel being poured into a funnel. You were going to let Cavallo's goon use that hammer, and you were going to sit in your mansion in Broadmoor and collect $1 million indemnity check while the police chalked it up to another dockside gangland hit. That isn't leverage, Evelyn. That's a body. She finally turned to look at me, and the cold gray void of her eyes was the most terrifying thing I'd seen in years. There was no hatred, no malice, no regret, just a flat, hollow absence of humanity. And what does it change? Arthur is a coward, Cavallo is a parasite, and this city is a funeral pyre waiting for a match. I'm just a woman who decided she didn't want to burn with the rest of you. I closed my eyes. The squad car hit a pothole, the suspension groaning in sympathy with my spine, and I felt the weight of the night settle onto my shoulders. I was a romantic, maybe. Or maybe I was just tired of watching the same play, in the same theater, with the same villains wearing different masks. We pulled into the precinct parking lot, a gray concrete box surrounded by a chain-link fence that looked like it had been erected to keep the sanity out. Detective Henderson, the man who had been ready to escort Evelyn to safety before the sirens turned the tide, was standing at the entrance, his face a mask of practiced indifference. He was a creature of the city, the kind of man who would trade his own grandmother for a quiet shift and a clean record, and he was already calculating how much distance he could put between himself and the Sterling collapse before the morning news cycle. He opened the door for Evelyn, his expression carefully neutral. She stepped out, her head held high, the queen of the ruins, walking toward the precinct entrance with a grace that was as infuriating as it was hollow. I followed her, my boots dragging, my coat heavy with the filth of the waterfront. As we passed the double-glass doors, the atmosphere changed. The smell of the street, the coal smoke, the brine, the oil, was replaced by the smell of human desperation, cigarette smoke, floor wax, and the metallic tang of an interrogation room. I didn't go to the processing desk. I went to the bullpen, found a desk, and sat down, dropping my hat onto a stack of paperwork. I felt like a ghost haunting his own life. After an hour, or maybe it was 3, I couldn't keep track anymore. The captain, a man named Miller, who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of cold, wet oak, walked over to my desk. He held a thick manila folder in his hand, the real one, the one Arthur had been protecting in the lining of his suitcase. "You pulled a miracle, Nile," Miller said, dropping the file onto my desk with a heavy thud. "The federal boys are already crawling all over the Sterling timber accounts. You just blew the lid off the biggest racketeering operation in the Pacific Northwest since the Prohibition era. Every name in this book is headed for a grand jury by Monday." "What about her?" I asked, gesturing toward the holding cell area. "What about Evelyn?" Miller looked at me, his eyes tired, the lines around his mouth deepening. "She's got the best legal counsel in the state, Harry. The insurance policy will be tied up in litigation for a decade. She's already claiming she was the victim of a sophisticated fraud perpetrated by her husband and a rogue mob syndicate. She's got bank records, tax filings, and a signed affidavit from a dozen corporate lawyers saying she was completely unaware of the offshore accounts. She was the architect." I snapped, my voice rising until the other detectives in the room stopped their work to look over. "Maybe," Miller said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly rumble. "But a court of law doesn't care about what you know. It cares what you can prove. And right now, all you've proven is that Arthur Sterling was an embezzler and Leo Cavallo is a criminal. Evelyn Sterling? She's just a grieving wife who got caught in the crossfire of her husband's secret life. She'll walk, Harry, probably by sunrise, maybe even by lunch." I looked down at the file, at the neat typed list of names, the columns of numbers, the precise cold calculations of a woman who viewed human life as a depreciating asset. "It's not enough," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "It's never enough." "It's never about enough, Nile," Miller said, turning to walk away. "It's about the bill. You keep the ledger, you pay the cost. That's how the city works. Go home, get some sleep. You look like you've been run over by a ferry." I didn't go home. I sat there for a long time, watching the activity of the precinct. The ebb and flow of the petty thieves, the drunks, the desperate, and the damned. I felt like I was watching a loop of film that would never end, the detail that wouldn't die. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the empty matchbook from the velvet lounge. I stared at the black and gold lettering, the glossy finish, the way the light caught the edges of the worn cardboard. I stood up, walked over to the precinct's evidence locker room, and signed for a property release. It took 15 minutes of yelling at a sergeant who didn't want to get up from his chair, but eventually, I was holding the small, leather-bound black ledger that Arthur had kept in the valise. I didn't open it. I knew exactly what was inside. I walked out of the precinct, down the steps, and into the gray, misty morning. The city was waking up, the trucks rumbling down the waterfront, the whistles of the tugboats signaling the start of the day. I found a payphone on the corner of the street, stood in the damp, and dialed a number I had scribbled in the back of my notepad. "Yeah?" a voice answered, a voice that sounded like iron on stone. "I've got the ledger," I said, my voice steady, my grip on the receiver white-knuckled. "The real one. The one with the signatures. The one that proves she didn't just know about the embezzlement, she directed it." There was silence on the other end of the line. A long, heavy, suffocating silence. "Who is this?" the voice finally asked. "A private investigator," I said. "And I'm tired of the bill." I hung up the phone. I stood there on the corner, the rain starting to pick up again, falling in cold, sharp needles against the pavement. I had the ledger, I had the truth, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the law to do the work. I walked down the street, my footsteps rhythmic, deliberate, and final. The setup was complete, the pieces were in place, and for once, the game wasn't going to end the way the house wanted. I had one more move to make, one more meeting to keep, and then I was going to find a bar, order a drink, and try to remember what it felt like to be a man with only one name. Case closed? Not yet. The Seattle rain was starting to fall hard again, washing the grime from the sidewalks. But the rot in the city was deep. It went all the way to the bedrock, and tonight, I was going to see just how far down the foundation really went. I pulled my trench coat collar up against the wind, jammed my hands into my pockets, and walked into the gray, indifferent morning. A man with a ledger, a gun, and a debt that was finally going to be paid in full. The setup was perfect. All I needed now was a victim. And I was pretty sure I knew exactly who the sacrifice was going to be. The morning was cold, the city was cruel, and the end was just beginning. Just another Friday in the Emerald City, where the rain doesn't just fall, it waits for the bodies to hit the ground. Chapter 9. The Unmasking. The gray light of the Seattle morning had barely managed to squeeze through the clouds when I arrived at the abandoned warehouse on the industrial fringes of the Port of Seattle. It was a skeletal structure of rusted corrugated iron and rotting cedar pilings, a place where the city went to bury its mistakes. I didn't park. I left the car 3 blocks away and approached on foot, my boots crunching on broken glass and discarded shell casings. I was holding the black ledger in my left hand, the real one, the one with the signatures, the dates, the cold hard proof that Evelyn Sterling was not just a grieving widow, but the mastermind of a multi-million-dollar syndicate operation. I walked into the belly of the beast, the air inside smelling of wet sawdust and trapped stagnant rot. The space was cavernous, filled with the ghostly silhouettes of empty pallets and half-collapsed crates. At the center of the warehouse, a single flickering bulb hung from a frayed wire, casting a harsh, jaundiced light on 2 figures waiting in the dark. Arthur Sterling stood near a wooden crate, his face pale, his wire-rimmed glasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. He looked like a man waiting for the electric chair. Opposite him, standing with the relaxed, predatory confidence of a woman in her own living room, was Evelyn. She had discarded the parka. She was back in her silk dress, her hair perfectly waved, her eyes cold and steady. She wasn't holding a gun anymore. She didn't need one. She had a man standing behind her, a man in a sharp-cut suit, the kind of suit that said lawyer or fixer. She saw me enter the pool of light, and she didn't look surprised. She looked satisfied. "Mr. Nile," she said, her voice echoing in the warehouse's hollow space. "I was beginning to think you'd decided to retire." "I thought about it," I said, walking into the circle of light and stopping 10 feet away. But then I remembered the ledger. It's hard to retire when you're carrying the weight of a city's corruption in your pocket. "Is that what you think you have?" Evelyn laughed, a dry, dismissive sound that bounced off the metal walls. You have a book of names, Harry. You have a collection of scribbles that can be explained away by any half-decent attorney as the ramblings of an embezzling husband. You have nothing. I have the signatures, Evelyn, I said, holding the black book up. The ones on the timber trust transfers. The ones that prove you authorized every single move, every offshore wire, every shell company liquidation. The ones that prove you weren't an unwitting victim of Arthur's greed. You were the architect of the whole damn thing. Evelyn didn't move. She just stared at the ledger, her gaze sharpening, turning into something predatory. She took a step toward me. "Give it to me, Harry," she said, her voice lowering, dropping the polite high society mask and revealing the cold metallic core of her true personality. "Think about your life. Consider the Yesler Way office. Think cheap bourbon and a radiator that sounds like a dying man. You give me that book and you can walk out of here with enough cash to disappear. You can go anywhere. You can be anyone." I looked at Arthur. He was trembling, his hands buried in his pockets, his eyes darting back and forth between me and his wife. He was a man who had tried to play a game he didn't understand, and now he was looking at the board and realizing he'd already lost his king. "Arthur," I said, not taking my eyes off Evelyn. Tell her you still have the carbon copies, the ones you kept in the lining of that suitcase." Arthur blanched. I don't. "He doesn't have anything, Harry," Evelyn said, her voice smooth as oil. "He's a frightened little man who lost his nerve the moment he stepped onto that pier. He's a liability, and by morning he'll be a memory." I saw the fixer behind her. He didn't move, but his hand was inside his coat. I knew that movement. It was the movement of a man who was about to turn a conversation into a crime scene. "I didn't come here to negotiate," I said, my voice cutting through the damp, heavy air. "I came here to lay it out. The insurance policy, the framing of the mob, the systematic liquidation of the timber empire, the attempted murder of your husband at the pier. It's all here. Every date, every wire transfer, every bribe paid to Henderson and his crew." "You have no proof," she insisted, though for the first time, a flicker of genuine fear crossed her face. "I have more than that," I said, and I reached into my coat pocket. I didn't pull a gun. I pulled out a small metallic object and tossed it onto the floor between us. It was a portable, wire-bound recording device, the kind used by the press to catch politicians in a lie. "I wasn't alone at the precinct, Evelyn," I said, watching her face go white as the realization hit her. "When I left the property room, I didn't go for a walk. I went to the district attorney's office. The conversation we had in the back of the squad car, the one where you explained how leverage works, the one where you admitted that you didn't care about the money or the mob, you just didn't want to burn with the rest of us. The DA heard all of it. He's got it on wax. He's got it in black and white." Evelyn stared at the recording device, her composure shattering like a dropped mirror. She looked at the lawyer, but he was already retreating, his hand coming out of his coat, empty. He knew when a game was over. He knew when the evidence was absolute. "You," she breathed, the word a mix of horror and disbelief. "I'm a romantic, Evelyn," I said, my voice steady, my grip on the ledger firm. "I believe in the truth, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's ugly." The warehouse's silence was absolute. The rain outside seemed to have stopped, or maybe I just couldn't hear it anymore. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic thumping of Arthur's heart, a desperate, rapid-fire beat that seemed to fill the entire space. Evelyn looked at me, then at the ledger, then at the recording device. For a moment I thought she might reach for the gun the fixer surely had hidden somewhere, or that she might lunge for the book. But she was a calculating woman, and she knew exactly when the odds had shifted to zero. She turned to Arthur. She looked at him with an expression of such pure, crystalline hatred that it made me shudder. "You did this," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous coil. "You invited this filth into our lives. You thought you could hide behind a ghost, and all you did was invite the vultures." "I just wanted to live," Arthur screamed, his voice breaking. "I just wanted out." "You'll get out, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You'll get out exactly the way you deserve." She turned and started walking toward the warehouse exit. The fixer followed, his face a neutral, blank slate of professional detachment. He didn't even look back. They walked out of the warehouse, their silhouettes framed by the gray, watery light of the morning, disappearing into the mist of the Seattle waterfront. I didn't try to stop them. I didn't need to. The squad cars were already turning into the industrial access road, their sirens silent now, their red lights flashing against the rusted metal walls. Arthur collapsed onto the floor, the suitcase spilling open, papers fluttering like dead birds in the draft. He sat there, his head in his hands, sobbing. I walked over to him, picked up the black ledger, and tucked it into my coat. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who had spent 48 hours wading through a sewer, only to find that the pipes were just as clogged as they were when he started. Police poured into the warehouse, Henderson in the lead, his face pale and sweating. He looked at me, then at the ledger in my hand, then at Arthur on the floor. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know about the Sterling investigation's future. "You're a real piece of work, Nile," Henderson muttered, stepping past me to handcuff Arthur. "I try," I said, turning away from the chaos, the flashing lights, and the crying man on the floor. I walked out of the warehouse and into the cold, gray morning. The rain had started again, falling in a fine, persistent mist that clung to everything it touched. I started walking back toward the center of the city, my boots crunching on the wet gravel. The case was closed. The ledger was in the right hands. The widow was exposed, and the husband was in custody. But as I walked through the quiet streets, listening to the city begin its long, miserable day, I realized that nothing had changed. The rot was still there. The leverage was still there. The money, the power, and the desperate, clutching hands of the people who controlled it. It was all still there, waiting for the next rain to wash it deeper into the cracks. I stopped at a street corner, pulled a cigarette from my pocket, and realized the matchbook was gone. I didn't care. I didn't even try to find a light. I just stood there, letting the mist soak into my coat, and for the first time in my life, I felt like a man with no name at all, just a ghost in a trench coat, walking through a city that had forgotten how to be clean. I kept walking, into the gray, into the mist, and into the rest of my life. The rain fell, the city sighed, and the ledger was finally closed. Chapter 10. The Crook Cracks. The interrogation room at Central Precinct was a small, windowless box that smelled of stale coffee, industrial floor wax, and the quiet desperation of a dozen other men who had run out of road. A single, naked bulb hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on Arthur Sterling's face. He looked 10 years older than he had on the pier. His wire-rimmed glasses were smeared with grit. His suit was a rumpled, damp rag, and he sat hunched over the metal table as if he were trying to shrink into himself until he vanished completely. Detective Henderson stood in the corner, his arms crossed, watching the proceedings with the bored detachment of a man waiting for the shift change. He wasn't interested in the truth. He was interested in the paperwork. I stood in the shadows near the door, my trench coat still heavy with the damp of the waterfront. I had the ledger in my pocket, but I didn't need it anymore. Arthur was already broken. He had cracked the moment the sirens hit the warehouse, his resolve evaporating like steam off a hot pipe. "You're a small fish, Arthur," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the cramped room. "You were the one holding the ledger, the one running with the valise, the one who tried to play both sides against the middle. But the DA doesn't want you. He wants her. He wants the woman who signed the transfers, the woman who directed the liquidations, the woman who took out the policy." Arthur's shoulders heaved. He didn't look up. "She'll kill me," he whispered, the sound barely audible over the hum of the light bulb. "Even from a cell, she'll find a way. She always finds a way. She's not just a woman, Nile. She's the storm." "The storm is over," I said, pulling out a chair and sitting down opposite him. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low and steady. "She's not in control anymore. The ledger is in the Fed's hands, and Henderson here has a stack of recordings as long as your arm. If you want to see the sun come up again, if you want to be more than just a footnote in a mob obituary, you start talking. You tell the truth about the timber trusts, the insurance scheme, and the night you vanished from the apartment." Arthur's hands trembled on the table. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and watery behind the smudged lenses. "She'll testify against me. She'll paint me as the mastermind. She'll show them the bank records she altered, the signatures she forged." "We have the originals," I interrupted, tapping the ledger in my pocket. "The real signatures, the ones that prove she knew about every single cent, the ones that prove you were just a tool in her cabinet, a cog in her machine. You cooperate, and I make sure the DA knows you are under duress. You clam up, and you're going to be the one taking the fall for every murder, every embezzlement, and every dirty dime that passed through that empire." Henderson grunted from the corner, shifting his weight. "He's right, Sterling. You're holding the bag. You want to drop it, or you want us to carry it for you into the electric chair?" Arthur looked at me, then at Henderson, then back at the table. He looked like a man standing on a precipice, staring down into the black water. For a long, silent minute, the only sound in the room was the buzz of the light bulb and the slow, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that seemed to be counting down his final seconds of freedom. Then he began to speak. It started as a trickle, a soft, hesitant admission of the initial embezzlement, the way he'd started skimming the timber dividends to cover some losses in the loan sharking operation he'd been forced into by Cavallo. But as he kept going, the dam broke. He poured it all out, the way Evelyn had discovered the skimming, how she'd taken the ledger and used it to blackmail him into expanding the scheme into the timber trusts, the way she had personally directed the offshore transfers, the way she had ordered the insurance policy, and the chilling, matter-of-fact way she had planned the accidental death on the pier. He talked about the nights in the Broadmoor house, the cold, analytical conversations about the city's power brokers, the way she treated the lives of the people around her like entries in a balance sheet. He didn't leave anything out. He laid it all bare, the ambition, the greed, the calculated cruelty, and the terrifying empty space where her conscience should have been. Henderson stopped being bored. He grabbed a notepad and started scribbling, his pen flying across the paper. The interrogation room felt smaller, the air thicker as the confession unfolded. It was a roadmap of the city's corruption, a detailed guide to the way the Sterling Timber Empire had bled the local government, the labor unions, and the mob syndicate dry. When he finished, Arthur slumped back in his chair, his face ash-gray, his hands lying limp on the table. He looked like a man who had finally put down a heavy, soul-crushing burden. "Is that it?" Henderson asked, his voice subdued. "That's it," Arthur whispered. "Everything." I stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the concrete floor. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest, a mixture of exhaustion and a lingering, nagging bitterness. We had the confession, we had the ledger, we had the case. But as I looked at Arthur Sterling, a man who had sold his soul to a woman who had never possessed one, I realized that the victory felt less like a triumph and more like a long, slow exhale after holding my breath for 48 hours. "Henderson," I said, turning toward the door, "make sure he gets a lawyer, a real one, and make sure he's kept in a safe house until the grand jury convenes. If Evelyn Sterling's influence is as deep as he says, she's going to have people trying to silence him before the noon edition hits the streets." Henderson nodded, his face unreadable. "I'll take care of it, Nile. Go home. You look like hell." "I've felt like hell for a long time," I said. I walked out of the interrogation room, down the long linoleum-lined hallway, and through the double-glass doors of the precinct. The morning had officially arrived, the city waking up with the sound of trolley bells and the low, rhythmic thrum of traffic. I stood on the precinct steps, the cool, damp air washing over my face. I reached into my trench coat pocket, pulled out a fresh pack of Chesterfields, and struck a match against the stone railing. The flame flared, steady and bright, in the quiet, misty air. I took a long, deep drag, the smoke curling up toward the gray, weeping sky. I thought about the ledger, the woman in the jade-green dress, the man with two names, and the city that had watched the whole show with the indifferent, cold-blooded gaze of a predator. Nothing had really changed. There would be other ledgers, other embezzlers, other widows in Broadmoor houses who knew how to manipulate the power. The city would keep spinning, the rain would keep falling, and guys like me would keep walking through the shadows trying to make sense of the noise. I started walking toward my office on Yesler Way, my footsteps echoing on the wet, empty pavement. I was a private investigator. I lived in the spaces between the lines, the cracks in the foundation, the gray zones where the truth was just another form of currency. It wasn't a life for a romantic. It wasn't a life for a hero. It was just a life. I turned the corner, my shadow stretching long and thin on the brick wall beside me. I was a man with one name, Harry Nile, and that was enough. The city was cold, the morning was gray, and the case was finally, truly closed. I walked into the mist, the sound of my own heartbeat the only thing I could hear. For the first time in a long time, the weight on my shoulders didn't feel quite so heavy. The rain continued to fall, a steady, rhythmic, uncaring curtain, washing the streets, the buildings, and the sins of the city clean, at least for another day. And as I turned toward the office, I realized that, in the end, that was all you could ever hope for: a clean street, a clear head, and the courage to keep walking until you found the next one. I reached the bottom of the stairs to my office building, looked up at the frosted glass window where my name was printed in fading black letters, and felt a quiet, exhausted smile pull at the corners of my mouth. Just another Friday in the Emerald City. I climbed the stairs, 1, 2, 3, the old familiar rhythm, and unlocked the door. The radiator was cold, the room was quiet, and the smell of stale tobacco was waiting to greet me like an old friend. I walked to the desk, sat down, and for the first time in 2 days, I closed my eyes and let the silence take me. Everything was going to be exactly the same tomorrow. For a man like Harry Nile, that was the only truth that ever really mattered. The case was over, the ledger was stored, and the city was waiting for the next set of lies to begin. I exhaled, the smoke of my last cigarette curling into the air, and let the world fade into the background. I was Harry Nile, and this was my city. And tomorrow, I'd be back in the rain, waiting for the next shadow to walk through the door. Chapter 11. The Walkout. The dawn didn't bring any clarity, it just brought more rain. A thin, miserable drizzle that hung over Pioneer Square like a wet wool blanket, turning the neon of the storefronts into blurry, bleeding smears of color on the asphalt. I stood by the window of my office, watching the city wake up. Taxis prowling for fares, the first streetcars clanging along their tracks, the early shift dock workers shuffling toward the waterfront with their heads ducked against the wind. My office was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the rhythmic, hollow drip of the leaky gutter outside. The ledger was gone, locked away in the evidence room at the precinct, and the confession was in the hands of a DA, who was probably already thinking about his next campaign run. Arthur was in protective custody, terrified and babbling, and Evelyn was likely sitting in a holding cell, her jade green dress rumpled, already mentally drafting the motions her lawyers would file by noon. I felt like I had been hollowed. 48 hours ago, I was sitting at this desk, nursing a bottle of cheap bourbon, and wondering if the radiator would hold out through the winter. Now, I was just a man with a tired heart, an empty glass, and a city that looked exactly the same as it had when I started, only a little bit dirtier. I picked up my fedora from the desk and jammed it onto my head, checking the mirror on the back of the office door. I looked like hell. My eyes were bloodshot, my face was unshaven, and there was a dark purplish bruise forming along my jawline where the Chicago enforcer's hammer had grazed me. I adjusted the brim, straightened the collar of my trench coat, and took a deep breath. There was one last thing to do. I walked out of the office, down the linoleum-lined hallway, and into the cool, damp air of the street. I didn't head toward the docks or the precinct. I walked north, past the pawn shops and the greasy spoons, until I reached the small, nondescript apartment building in the Cascade neighborhood, the one where Arthur Sterling had lived his life as Richard Trent. I climbed the rusted fire escape to the second floor and stood outside apartment 3B. The door was still standing open, the lock I'd picked still hanging slightly loose in the jamb. Inside, the place was just as I'd left it: the narrow cot, the empty wardrobe, the scatter of papers on the small wooden table. It was a sad, pathetic tomb for a man who had tried to build a life out of lies. I walked over to the table and picked up one of the few things left behind, a small, inexpensive framed photograph. It was of Lola, the lounge singer from the Velvet Lounge. She wasn't smiling in this one. She was looking off camera, her expression caught in a moment of quiet, genuine exhaustion. She looked like a woman who had spent too many nights singing torch songs to drunks and bad men. A woman who had been looking for a way out just as badly as Arthur had been. I looked at the photo for a long time. They were both running, weren't they? Arthur running from the mob and his ice-cold wife, and Lola running from the life that had trapped her in a red velvet dive bar. They had found each other in the dark, two ghosts looking for a place to hide, and all they had managed to find was a cold apartment in Cascade and a bullet train to nowhere. I set the photograph back down on the table. It didn't belong to me. Nothing in this apartment did. I walked out, closing the door behind me with a firm, solid click. I didn't look back as I walked down the fire escape and into the alley. I found a small, hole-in-the-wall diner on the corner of 4th and Pike. the kind of place that stayed open all night to feed the graveyard shift and the lost souls. I took a seat at the counter, the smell of burnt coffee and frying bacon hitting me like a physical comfort. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Bessie, slid a steaming mug of black coffee in front of me without being asked. "Rough night, sugar?" she asked, her voice a gravelly, sympathetic rasp. "You could say that, Bessie," I said, wrapping my hands around the hot ceramic. "Do you ever feel like you've spent the whole night digging a hole, only to realize you were burying yourself?" Bessie chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Every damn day, Harry, every damn day. But you're still walking, and you're still drinking the coffee. That counts for something in this town." I took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter, strong, and burned a welcome path down my throat. "Yeah," I said, looking out the window at the gray, misty morning. "I guess it does." I paid for the coffee, tipped her $1, a small, pointless gesture in a world that didn't care about tips, and walked out into the street. The rain had stopped, replaced by a thick, heavy fog that rolled in off the bay, swallowing the buildings and the streets until the world was nothing but white noise and dampened sound. I started walking again, my destination unclear, my purpose gone. The case was closed, the ledger was stored, and the widow was exposed. The game was over, and the house had won, as it always did. But as I walked through the fog, I realized something. I wasn't waiting for the next client. I wasn't waiting for the next lie. I was just walking. For the first time in years, I was just a man on a street in Seattle, with no debt to pay, no secrets to hide, and no ghosts to chase. It was a lonely feeling, but it was also pure. I reached the waterfront, the mist turning the ships in the harbor into gray silhouettes, their horns echoing with a deep, mournful resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. I walked to the edge of the pier, looked out into the void, and pulled my last cigarette from the pack. I didn't light it. I just held it between my fingers, feeling the smooth, dry texture of the tobacco paper, and watched the fog swallow the horizon. The man with 2 names was gone. The widow was behind bars, or soon would be, and Harry Nile was just a man with a fedora, a trench coat, and a heart that had finally stopped racing. I thought about Arthur, and I thought about Evelyn, and I thought about the ledger that had cost so much and meant so little. I thought about the city, with its cold heart and its dark secrets, and I realized that I wasn't just a part of it. I was the mirror it used to see itself, and sometimes, when the light hits just right, you don't like what you see. But that was okay, because the mirror doesn't decide what to reflect, it just shows the truth. And if the truth is ugly, that's the city's problem, not mine. I turned around, walked away from the water, and started back toward the center of the city. I was going to find a bar. I was going to order a glass of bourbon, not the cheap stuff, not for once, and I was going to sit there until the world started to make sense again. And if it didn't, well, that was okay too, because tomorrow the sun would rise, the rain would fall, and I would be here, waiting in the shadows, ready for whatever the next lie decided to bring to my door. I walked into the fog, my silhouette blending into the gray, until there was nothing left but the sound of my own footsteps, rhythmic, steady, and final. Just a man with 1 name, walking through a city that never stops, in a world that never sleeps, doing a job that never ends. Case closed. I reached into my pocket, felt the empty matchbook one last time, and tossed it into the gutter. It spun for a moment in the wet, dark water before disappearing into the drain, swept away by the current of the city, lost in the rush of the storm. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, my coat collar turned up against the wind, my hat pulled low over my eyes, heading into the gray, into the mist, and into the rest of my life. The rain began to fall again, a soft, steady rhythm against the pavement, a sound I knew better than my own pulse. I was Harry Nile, and this was the end of the line. But in a city like Seattle, the end is just the beginning of the next long, dark night. I kept walking, into the light that wasn't there, toward a future that had already happened, and I left the case of the man with 2 names behind me in the shadows, where it belonged. Everything was silent, everything was still, and for the first time in a long time, the only thing that mattered was the next step. I took it, and then I took another, and then I was gone.